Welcome to episode 55 of the Filmumentaries podcast. This is Jamie Benning talking to you not from my little home office this time, but from Eugene, Oregon. I'm out here for 2 weeks working on the World Athletics TV coverage. I've been here for about a week and a half, so just a few days left, and it's an odd town. It's quiet in terms of foot traffic. Downtown is really, really quiet. Yeah, it's so noisy. You probably just heard that truck going by. I'm in like a little sleepy neighborhood where there's trains, loud trucks, cars revving up in the middle of the night, leaf blowers, reversing vehicles, and dust carts and trash vans and all that kind of stuff from like 4 a.m. Then there's lots of people jogging and shouting to each other. This is Tracktown, USA. So I'm a little sleep deprived and a little cranky, but I've also had the opportunity to see some good friends who I used to travel with on the other motorsport jobs, so it's been really nice to see them. If you're new to the podcast, welcome. And once you've listened to this one, do go back and check out the 54 episodes that came before it. I really have been lucky in getting some amazing guests, including directors, sound designers, documentarians. Well, you'll see the whole list if you just check back. If you're a regular listener, thanks for joining me again. And if you support this very independent podcast, it is just me and my laptop, then may you be bestowed with glittering gifts. Actually, in fact, if you do support me via patreon.com/Jamie Benning, JamieBenning, depending on the tier you choose, you could well receive some glittering gifts. Maybe not glittering, but gifts anyway. Have a check out of the different tiers on Patreon and see what you think. Don't forget, you can also find me on the Filmumentaries Facebook page as Jamie SWB on Twitter, on the Filmumentaries Instagram account, also at filmumentaries.com. I nearly forgot the name of my website. Anyway, back to the business of today. This time my guest is film composer Daniel Pemberton. Now, before I go any further, I just want to take a moment to thank my friend and colleague John Lyons for connecting me with Daniel. Initially, we spoke several months ago, but as you might imagine, Daniel has been busy and we couldn't match dates at all. And then one of them came up and it was like, okay, let's do it today. And I whizzed into London and did the interview. So some Daniel facts for you. Another loud vehicle goes by. I can only assume that the guys here are making up for something else, because every vehicle seems to be louder than your average vehicle. So Daniel, at the age of 16, released his first album, which got quite a lot of attention. He then worked for several years creating scores for television, including the cherished Peep Show, a bunch of documentaries and other shows. And then he had the opportunity to move over to film. He's worked with Ridley Scott, Aaron Sorkin, Guy Ritchie, Danny Boyle, Edward Norton, and many other directors. He's in really high demand and is always working. He's regularly been cited, another loud vehicle. Thank you. He's regularly been cited as one of the most exciting and original new voices working in modern film scoring today. We talk about that. We talk about how, there isn't a Daniel Pemberton style. Maybe there's a Daniel Pemberton energy or something, but he can do everything. It really seems like he can. We finally managed to arrange a day for me to join him in his home in London, but because Daniel had been working so hard, he wanted to get out of the house or the apartment and the studio that he works in. So we did the interview in a local park. So like my noisy intro, you'll be able to hear some dogs fighting, a Chinook helicopter goes over at one point, and the general atmos of a London park at lunchtime. I did then get the opportunity to go up to his apartment, the Genius's lair, strewn with instruments and synths and bits of audio kit, LPs, CDs. You really do get the impression that Daniel is committed and very much in love with his craft. And he did actually play me part of one of the scores that he's working on, and his enthusiasm is just so evident when he did that. So here's my interview with film composer Daniel Pemberton, and I'll be back at the end for a bit more jabbering on. When did your passion for music begin? Was there a moment that you had where you kind of look back now and think that was it?
Yeah, it was a very strong moment, which was when I was about, I think, 10 or 11. I'd gone to, my dad took me to the planetarium next to Madame Tussauds, which is now some terrible Marvel Superstars thing, but then it was like classic planetarium, space, planets. Sat in that, and there was this music playing that was like crazy synthesizer music. It was a lot of it was like Oxygen by Jean-Michel Jarre, and Equinox and some Vangelis and stuff like that. And it was the first time I'd heard music that felt like nothing I'd ever heard. And I was like, oh my God, what is this thing? And it literally flicked a switch in my head. And that day afterwards, I was obsessed by music. Like beforehand, I was not super interested in it, but it's a very, very, very strong memory. And after that, I just kind of became obsessed by sort of sound and electronic music.
Yeah, I think most of the people I've spoken to have had that kind of moment. A lot of them have been involving their parents, have taken them somewhere or given them something or passed it on. Did you have any kind of mentors, either knowingly or unknowingly, leading up to where you are now?
There were certain people who like supported me in different ways. When I was about like 15, I started making I got very into ambient music, or electronic music, which was a kind of a scene around like 92, 94. A lot of interesting bands like the Future Sound of London, Aphex Twin, The Orb.
Oh yeah.
And I got really into that world. I used to go to these club nights. They were started by this girl called Chantel, who was Mira Calix, who sadly died early this year, and this guy called Kevin Folks, who's sort of better known as DJ Food. And they used to run these quite amazing, like, ambient sort of, I won't say raves, 'cause they weren't raves, like sort of crazy chill out rooms in squats in like Brixton and things like this. I got really into that. It was another sort of amazing sound world, and I started making my own music. And I had a synthesizer that I saved up for, Korg Wave Station, and a Fostex X28 4-track, and that's all I had. Didn't even have a sequencer, and I would just record stuff onto the 4-track, and then I would make tapes of my music and give them to people at these events.
Yeah.
And one person was this guy called Mixmaster Morris, who was like a sort of big chill out DJ around then, and he thought they're great. He's like, I love these. I'm going to put you in my DJ chart. It's really important. And so he puts me in his DJ chart. This kind of unsigned sort of what is this act? And so from there, I started getting a lot of like interest from sort of record labels, and had a sort of bunch of offers to put a record out. And I ended up going with this German label called Fax, which is run by this guy called Pete Namluke. It's sort of quite cool, quite obscure German electronic label. He used to do records. He used to put out almost a record every week, and he'd sort of do like albums with Klaus Schulze or like his own ones. This sort of insane industry of just like constant, like just releasing, like sort of self-financing. Had a fan base. They'd put them out in limited runs, and they'd sort of put a record out every month or a couple of weeks.
Right.
I didn't really know what I wanted to do, whether I actually wanted to do music properly, and it felt like a good fit. So I did my first record with them, and that wouldn't have really happened without Mixmaster Morris's sort of help early on. And then when I did that record, a director called Paul Wilmshurst heard it and really liked it, and I knew his sort of girlfriend, because I was writing about digital technology and she was interested in that, and he asked me to score a documentary.
Right.
And so you have people who take chances on you. So I did my first TV score, I think I was 17. sort of come home doing my homework.
Still at school, right?
Still at school doing my homework, and then I'd be like, oh, I've got to write this TV show now. And while they weren't necessarily mentors, they were people who like had a big impact in like pushing me on to the next level. But in terms of like an actual mentor, nah, because for ages I thought, oh, there's gonna be someone who's gonna show me how to do film music or all this kind of stuff. And then it's only when it dawned on me that person was never going to exist and I had to do everything myself and work everything out myself. That was like really important moment, because I'm like, okay, shit, it's all down to me. I've got to do this. Yeah. And so that kind of pushed me to like learn more and just constantly keep trying to do things that would push me into new places I hadn't been before. So I'd always, anytime I'd do any type of TV score, at that point, I'd always try and do something that I hadn't done before, like just so I could learn about it. Like, let's do an electric guitar score and work out the best way to record this, or let's try and do a jazz score. Like, okay, how do I book jazz musicians? I don't know. I'll go and find some. I'll go and then get their phone numbers. And, all those sort of early steps were really important in terms of like how I could approach film music now.
Yeah. Did you find like going back to when you were 17 there, you're still at school, you had this limited kit. Did you feel like you hit the ceiling of what was capable with that kit early on? And did you feel like a need to buy more stuff? There is that kind of collector's attitude amongst musos as well, isn't there? That the more equipment is going to give you more flexibility, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, it's really interesting looking at that time, the excitement of like getting a tape player that wouldn't give you hiss. Like, hiss was such a big deal for recording onto 4 tracks. If you want to bounce, if you bounce, you're going to get lots of hiss. The more you bounce, the more you get hiss, and you've only got 4 tracks, and they're all mono. And you were always dreaming of like, oh, if I got a digital recorder, and they didn't even exist at that time, really, and they're really, really expensive. So you spend a long time thinking about gear and how it would solve all your problems. But I think the limitations of that era were really, really important to me, in that I could program the Korg wave station like better than anyone else. Well, I mean, I'm sure there are people who could program better than me, but to be honest, but it's one of the things I was really, really good at it.
Yeah.
I'm not good at anything now, like in terms of like one piece of kit.
Right.
And it's only now, in retrospect, you sort of look back and you realise why the stuff I was making was interesting was because I only had one synth, and I had like delved into the very sort of deepest crevices of what it could do, like. Because I was desperate to make anything sound interesting. You couldn't even do like, it didn't. The wave station was a weird synth because it didn't have like some of the classic analog stuff of like low pass filters, and the only way you could do it would be through a weird effects, like in the effects board, do a sort of false thing, and that was it's interesting because you'd be like, well, how can I get a cool effect or make this sound interesting? All right, I'll just fiddle around with the parameters on the phasing. And just wiggle them around a lot while I record it. Yeah. And so it makes quite an interesting effect. And that sort of stuff I wouldn't do now. Like, I would do it because I remember doing it as a kid. But like, it's that moment when you got less, it pushes you to do more. And, I'm still writing these scores in the same flat that I've been in like 20 years. Don't have a massive factory. Don't have millions of underlings churning out stuff. It's still just, it's just me in front of the same setup, really. And that's kind of important because I think there is this real tendency for people to be like, buy more gear, and then your sound will be better. Yeah. But these days you get so much in just logic. You don't need it. You should learn it. Like, if I could go back to being 16, I would definitely probably know what I could do under those limitations better now. Yeah. With like sort of the knowledge and hindsight I have now, but I think limitations are really valuable, and I try and all my scores I try and really bring them into play. So each score I'll try and early on is limit the sound palette and be like, right, this is what we've got to play with. Yeah. How do we make this work? Because I think that forces you to be more inventive. If you've got everything at your disposal,
there's no ceiling anywhere. Yeah. I could imagine as well in those days of working on a lot of the Channel 4 stuff, when kind of Channel 4 was at the height of its creativity, if you like, and its sort of willingness to go off the beaten track, as it were. That must have been a really fortuitous time for you to be there.
Yeah, I mean, I was so lucky to be at this amazing moment, which is sort of mid-late 90s in television, where Channel 4 was really, really, really inventive, really creative, amazing directors working there. And they were all just doing whatever they wanted to do. And, you know, it's hard to look at Channel 4 now and understand how groundbreaking it was around then. You know, I remember doing a documentary called White Tribe, just dark as hell, looking at sort of like kind of structural racism in Britain, really. And it's really weird. You look at it now and you're like, oh, okay, that is why we got Brexit. It's really weird to look at this this film, which basically looks at like kind of like the death of like you know, what's perceived as like white culture,
Right.
And now you look at it and you're like, oh shit, like that was just waiting to blow up and become this weird political force. But you know, it's a crazy score. It's like got like space echo feedback over it for ages. It's got like weird sort of homemade bad dub music. It was just me experimenting the whole time, director experimenting. And this was going out 9 o'clock on Channel 4, billboards. I remember seeing a billboard for it in Vauxhall. And you were working with directors who wanted to be different. And you know, if I want to get really nerdy, I can kind of really explain why everything changed. So there's a thing called a Terms of Trade Agreement, which meant that Channel 4 initially, the way the shows are made, where if you're a production company, you get some money, you'd make a show, and you know, you'd keep a bit of the money, and you spend the rest making the show, and Channel 4 would then own the show. And what that meant was that the companies who made the shows, their kind of main principle was really just to make a show that was so like good enough that they get commissioned again.
Right.
So they're just like, we just want to make a great show. We'll get another commission off it. And what sort of changed was they ended up allowing the producers to kind of keep their rights and sell the shows themselves.
Right.
Which kind of sounds really cool because you're like, great, like more indie production companies getting stronger. But what that really meant was all this sort of venture capital money comes into the industry, and suddenly, you know, they're more interested in making shows that they can make as cheap as possible, as many as possible, and you've got like formatting things. So if you're making a 1 hour documentary about a tree, which I did once, you know, it's a lot of work. And I mean, it might not sound like a lot of work. It was like the oldest tree in the world. It's called the Methuselah tree. Yeah. It's just to pick one at random. Whereas if you can do you know, it's like graphics, it's research, it's like traveling, it's like, you know, like so much stuff goes into some of these documentaries. Or you make 10 shows about someone looking at someone else's kitchen for like, you know, a lot cheaper. Channel 4 gets a bunch of content really cheap. And so the sort of the whole industry moved, and like the venture capital companies, you know, they'd buy an indie, and then they'd buy another indie, and they'd start swallowing them all up. And now you get to the stage where like most TV is very financially driven, rather than creativity driven. And the creativity driving is only really there as a sort of way to get like an extra foothold financially. Whereas when I was there, it was kind of really like a sandbox of just do whatever you want to do. And you know, there's certain directors like Paul Wilmshurst, who gave me my first job. A company called Windfall, some great people there. There's a guy called Ian Duncan who had a big impact on me in terms of how he wanted me to approach music, and he was always like, I want this to sound different. I remember when I did my first orchestral score, which was this Channel 4 show called Edwardian Country House, and I was really, really proud of it. Like, I was like, oh my God, I've done an orchestral score. This is such a big deal. And I remember Ian just going, yeah, but it kind of sounds ordinary. Right. And it was like a slight kick in the gut, but he was right in a way. I mean, I'm very proud of that score, but I love the way he was always pushing me to do things differently. You know, he kind of like was the first guy to really kind of start inventing the doc reconstruction and using different, you know, like all these things you see are so commonplace now. But I remember when we did that, we did a show, and he was like, they were actually reconstructing these historical moments, and then he would shoot them on Super 8 or something, and now that's like 10 a penny in documentaries.
Yeah.
But at the time, it was quite revolutionary because it was always just talking heads and some rostrum work by Ken Morse. So that whole period of British TV was incredibly important to me because it sort of shaped my film music massively.
Did the change in the way that TV was structured and financed that you just described, was that part of the catalyst for the sort of jumping ship to film, or is it more seen in your mind as a progression from TV?
Well, no, I mean, as much as I'd love to say I had this very clever plan where this was, a lot of the things you just kind of get some lucky breaks and you just run with them. I mean, TV was getting... I used to be a real stickler for like not signing my publishing rights away, which is kind of a boring but kind of important thing. And so I would start not working with companies if they wanted my publishing rights, because they do nothing with the music. They just fucking stick it in a box and it's dead.
Yeah.
And I was always like, I really care about this music. And I think one of the reasons I did well on TV was I actually genuinely really cared about making good music. And the same with film. I want to make really good scores. I want to make scores I'm proud of, that I really believe in. And in TV for a long time, I was starting to shut a lot of doors on me because there's companies I just wouldn't work with. But what was interesting was that was actually really valuable. And sometimes the doors that shut are as important as the doors that open. And it meant I would only be working really with companies that really valued me being and what I would bring to a project.
Yeah.
And so it meant you were dealing with companies that weren't necessarily financially driven. They were creativity driven. And that meant I could keep doing interesting work. And it also meant I kept working with interesting directors.
Yeah.
And, through that process, that's how I kind of got into film. Like the first director to give me a film was this guy called Nick Murphy. And I worked on him on Edwardian Country House, the reality show. And, it's like connections like that, which are like how you get onto the next stage.
What was the movie?
It was called The Awakening. So it was Rebecca Hall.
Yeah.
And that was an amazing moment for me, because I always say like getting into the film industry is a bit like, the film industry is kind of like a party. I mean, it's not like a party, but imagine a party and there's all the film people inside and the TV people are outside. I mean, TV and film is a different beast now, but it used to be like this. And someone in the TV world, let's say a director, gets invited into the film party. So they go in and they say their name and the bouncer's like, come on in. And then, they go, I'm bringing this guy, Daniel, with me. And then the bouncer's like, nah, he's not on the list. Just you on the list. He's not. We've got composers in there. And then if the directors at that point either go, sorry, Dan, can't do it. Or they turn to the bouncer and say, nah, he's coming in with me. And if they do it well enough, the bouncer goes, all right, if he misbehaves, I've got my eye on him. So then you're in the party, right? And then if you stick around the party long enough without making a tit of yourself or getting thrown out, then you kind of like, that's how you sort of, eventually start having a bit of a film career.
So there's like a probationary period almost.
Oh, yeah. I mean, like when you do your first couple of films, it is really lethal. Everyone's like, I wouldn't say they got their knives out, but everyone's very... there's a lot more trepidation about whether you can cut it. And, I had some pretty hairy experiences early on, and luckily I got through them all. But, it's very easy to fire composers. And there's always a lot more, I don't say eagerness, but when you're doing your first couple of films, until you've like earned your stripes, everyone's a lot more cagey. Or they're kind of waiting for you to fuck up, really.
Yeah, there seems to be, like, I've spoken to a lot of people in the industry, and I was in the film industry for a very brief time, and there seemed to be like an unwillingness to kind of change the status quo within the film industry, like whether it's a new piece of equipment or whether it's a new piece, a new person.
Yeah.
there does seem like to be that reluctance.
Yeah, I get why it is, in the sense of it's like, I mean, I love coming up with bad metaphors for everything, right? But it's like, like when everyone's, there's a lot at stake. It's a lot easier to go with something tried and tested. I have I had some whole metaphor about someone who ran a restaurant, and okay, so let's say you run a restaurant, and who are you going to bring in to do the lights, right? There's a company that does lights, and you're like, I got no fucking idea about lights in restaurants. I'm a pizza chef, right? I've started up my restaurant, and I don't know who's got the lights, and there's two lighting people. There's this guy, and they've done all the lights in every restaurant that you like ever.
Mm-hmm.
Or there's this, but they're quite expensive, and within the lighting industry, everyone thinks they're a bit boring now, okay? But they get the job done. Or there's this new person who has never lit any restaurant ever, and and they're really cheap, and they've got really great ideas, and they're probably going to do a better score than the big and so a lot of people be like, I got no idea, I don't know anything about lights. Like, why are we even talking about lights? I've got other things to do. I've got to make this pizza. I've got to do the chairs, menus. So they're just like, oh, just get the lighting people who do everything. And that's how I sort of feel a lot of it happens a lot of the time, where it's like, people don't want to take risks. If you're a director, you only have a number of people you can really bring with you, unless you're very strong, because the producers will just use it against you. Like, oh, you fucked up on that one. So, yeah, it is. I mean, I think it's sort of weird because TV, because everything's got super global, they're still like want these sort of inverted commas big names, and they're not great on taking chances on people. And again, that's what Channel 4 was great when I started out, was like, just people would take chances on you.
Yeah.
And those kind of shows don't get made now. So if they're doing like, a 6-part drama, everyone's going to be a lot more nervous.
Yeah. Well, when you worked for, let's pick Guy Ritchie for the first time, right?
Yeah.
So you're doing a film that is an established TV show.
Yeah.
There's already a score people have in mind. It's with a director who's known for his particular style and his way of filmmaking. How difficult is it to walk into something like that with all of those pressures, as well as the ones that come with having to, make something new of it and having to expand on what was already there?
I mean, it was really hard. Like, Man from U.N.C.L.E. was, I love that score. It's my favourite score.
It's a really good score. I was going to say, what you managed to do with it is you managed to kind of hint to all of the stuff that we know, the spy thriller stuff, without any pastiche involved, which is really difficult to pull off, because, if somebody tries to sort of do a Bond or anything else similar to that, like in the spy genre, it so easily comes off as like jokey and kind of too playful in a way, but you don't cross into that realm somehow.
Yeah, I think, Man from U.N.C.L.E. was very daunting to come onto, because if you looked at the previous films that Guy had done before that, the Sherlocks, I thought those scores, like by Hans and Lorne, were like really, really phenomenal. I still think they're brilliant scores, those. And you're like, shit, there's a very high bar here to kind of like match up to. And
so a Guy heard something you'd done already that brought you in at that point?
Well, it was weird. I had a meeting I was out in LA, and I had a meeting with Warner Brothers, and originally I think they wanted, I don't know how much this is out there, but like Kasabian were going to score the movie.
Right.
And I think they wanted someone just to sort of work with Kasabian. But and I was in Britain. The film was being made in Britain. There's probably some tax advantage for them to have a British composer, which often is how certain people get hired.
Yeah.
So it's like one of those sort of like slightly lucky breaks, and it was a how can I choose my words here? Challenging experience, and Guy is a interesting director, but he does have like a really good sort of ear for different music. And one of the things I think that is that's one of the most interesting things about Guy, is that he doesn't want stuff to feel like the same, and realizes that an audience needs something different
Yeah.
for it to work
Mm-hmm.
and feel engaging. And so, early on, we sort of worked out that we didn't want to do anything that sounded Bondy, because the sort of John Barry Bond template,
Yeah.
which I love, but was like so done to death in every
Mm-hmm.
spot. It just felt like trope and cliche. Whereas if you sort of went down the more European sort of route, or you sort of lent into scores by, like Lalo Schifrin
Yeah.
or Roy Budd, like the Roy Budd Git Carter score, for instance. I think it's still a phenomenal.
Yeah.
Like, sounds so good today. And that was a lot of inventive instrumentation and inventive ways to sort of score scenes, and like a lot of colour.
Guy's sending in the choppers right now.
Yeah.
There's a Chinook just going past us.
Probably is. So yeah, it was all about trying to, for me, get a very colourful sound palette, and then, again, give yourself the limitations of this palette, and then how do you go from there? Because a lot of those early, like those sort of more 60s scores, what's interesting about them is they are fundamentally based around non-conventional, non-orchestral instruments.
Yeah.
And so it's like, how do you get pace, or how do you get action, or how do you get emotion out of, a guitar, a bass, and a sitar or something? So that's what sort of pushed me to sort of make the Man from U.N.C.L.E. score. And then, the other thing is, Guy wants stuff to feel like tracks more than score. He doesn't really like score. He just wants everything to feel like tracks. So that's quite interesting. It took me a long time to work that out, but I did work it out. And he also has a really, really brilliant editor called James Herbert, who is like the sort of secret in that factory. And so I would generally work with James most of the time at working out how we were going to work sequences. He'd fire things to me, I'd fire them back, and we'd work very closely, redoing scenes over and over and over again.
So you had a kind of relationship where your music would influence his cut and his cut would influence your music?
Yeah, and we'd sort of just work backwards and forwards all the way through until we got
that's
something.
nice.
And then I'd write in a way that meant the musicians could really bring something to the final recording, which is what I try and do, because there's almost like two ways of writing. And there's a writing where you do a great demo, and everyone loves the demo, and they just want the score to sound like the demo. And so when you actually go record it, it doesn't sound that interesting because it sounds like a very well-produced demo. Whereas I like to try and do demos that aren't that great or have room for maneuver.
Sure, yeah.
And then when you get into the studio, you can sort of embellish it, add more stuff, get more interesting performances out, and then build something that can only really exist through like live performance.
Yeah.
Rather than just live performance that's copying sort of computer written scores.
Yeah, that's a nice way to put it. And I assume that you'd prefer to be brought on a project early rather than late, because you hear these sort of horrible stories of, they've put like a temp track on, which ultimately the composer comes in and has to kind of replicate, but not too closely.
Yeah, I mean, I've been pretty lucky in not really having a lot of temp issues. I normally try and I like to get in early if I can, like around script stage.
Yeah.
But to be honest, every project's different. I'm about to go on something where the film is done, and they just need the music sorting out. And that's great as well, because it means I haven't been through the slightly laborious process that they've had on this particular film, where they've sort of exhausted a bunch of other composers,
right,
working out what the film needed.
Right.
So it's every project's different. But in an ideal world, I like to kind of really be involved for a long time, and because then you can make more inventive ideas. Like when we did Steve Jobs, for instance, Danny Boyle, I wrote tons of stuff before he'd even started shooting.
Right.
And so he'd take it down on set, he'd play it on set, he'd get the vibe of it, and then sometimes he'd pick out really interesting pieces, and be like, use them in ways I wouldn't think of them being used.
Right.
Which lends itself to more you do more experimental work, because you've got the time and the space to mess up, basically. The more time you have to mess up, the more runway you've got to try different, like really out there ideas. If you've only got like 3 weeks left to do the movie, you haven't got time to fuck about and do silly ideas.
No.
But it's the silly sort of weird ideas that kind of keep pushing things forward and make things feel different.
Interesting that Danny chose to do it that way, to kind of, I imagine, to bring the tone of the film, you know, via your music to the actors and to those working on the set, because that's a completely different approach to a lot of directors, I would imagine, who would, you know, be thinking of the score during shooting but wouldn't necessarily be unveiling it to anyone.
I think with Danny, he's such a sort of visionary director who likes to always do things quite differently. And I kind of feel like one of the things I find really admire about him is the way he's always just working so many different styles and approaches, which is kind of what I've been trying to do with my own scores. It's not like, you know, here is the house Danny Boyle style. There's obviously things in his films which, you know, have a kinetic energy.
Yeah.
But, you know, things like, you know, 28 Days Later feels very different to Trainspotting, feels very different to Millions, or, you know, but there's a sort of, there's something which connects them all. But, you know, he likes to sort of take big swings and big risks, which is great.
But I guess that's why people employ you over somebody else, is because, you know, there's not a signature Daniel Pemberton style. There might be a sort of kinetic thread through all of your scores in a way, like they've got that kind of energy to them, but, you know, you're not known for one particular style. I mean, I think of something like Motherless Brooklyn, and that's, I mean, I would never have imagined that was you scoring that, having heard Spider-Verse, you know, which was around the same time.
Yeah, I literally got that job the day I finished Spider-Verse.
Right.
I turned up as exhausted. I met Edward Norton at I think midnight at Chiltern Firehouse. I turned up with all the scores from Spider-Verse. I was just like, we just finished recording. I'm completely exhausted. And I was like, I don't want to do this film. Not because I didn't want to do it. It was like, I really don't want to do any more films.
You needed a break.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's an opportunity not to be turned down, isn't it?
And then we just got chatting. And then weirdly, he started talking about how much he liked Chariots of Fire. And I was like, okay, this is really interesting, because no one talks about Chariots of Fire.
Vangelis, yeah.
Yeah, they'll talk about Blade Runner or some other things.
Yeah.
But, you know, or they'll, you know.
Well, you'd think that would make more sense, given it's a detective noirish Chinatown kind of thing.
We just talk about visuals and imagery, and I was like, wow, okay, this guy's really interesting. If he's realizing what makes Chariots of Fire so interesting, because it sort of almost became a cliche. Yeah. But it's really fascinating, and so as soon as he started talking about that, and he was like so enthusiastic, I was just like, shit, I'm gonna do this. I've got to do this movie. Yeah. But yeah, I like to try and do. You know, I always my thing is I always think about the audience is the most important thing. Like, people going to cinema, I want them to not have any idea what they're gonna experience. Yeah, yeah. And I think that's the greatest thing in cinema. If you think about all the films you've really enjoyed, you've sat down and they've surprised you. Yeah, yeah. Oh, dogfight, yeah. You know, they'll surprise you, and it's not. There's a lot of cinema which I say is like reheated meals. It's like the same meal you've had before. Let's heat it up a bit and put a different sauce on top. Yeah. And they do seem to be exceptionally popular. Everyone likes eating the same thing. But for me, I like trying to try out some new things. And when you get it right, I think that's the most exciting. Like, when you're in cinema and something is exciting and it's different. That's why I love, you know, even going to see Chris Nolan films. I love, I remember sitting during Tenet, and it was one of the first times I gone to cinema during the pandemic. IMAX around the corner in Waterloo. I remember just grinning, because I was like, I have no idea what's going to happen. Okay, especially with his films. And then, you know, there's like crazy sort of car chase. And I remember just thinking, this is brilliant. I don't know what's going to happen. You know, this film is not going to end with one big robot hitting another big robot. You know, it's like, I don't know where this is going to go. Yeah. And that's what makes cinema really exciting. And I kind of want that to happen through the music as well, where you don't know what you're going to hear.
Yeah, and you seem to manage to kind of find this place where, you know, your music kind of matches the visuals. In the case of Spider-Verse, I mean, that is so inventive, that movie, visually.
Yeah.
And what you did with the soundtrack kind of matches that same level, but it's just, again, it's not what you might have expected from a superhero movie at all.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of why I was drawn to Spider-Verse in the first place, was because, you know, I always want to really do movies that give me a chance to do something different, or the filmmakers are trying to do something different. You know, I do get offered certain movies where I'm like, I don't know how I can sort of inject any personality into that.
Yeah.
It's funny, I remember being offered like a lot of money to do a certain film, like, and my agent was like, oh my God, you got to take this. This is like such a big deal. And I was just like, I can't see me doing anything very inventive in this film.
Because it's not going to fit maybe with what people's expectations are.
Well, it's just like, I know, you know, certain films that are big want a certain type of...
You know, all the tropes, yeah.
Yeah, they like, if they're making it in a sort of slightly generic way, they want a slightly generic score.
Yeah.
So I was like, no, I'm going to do this like documentary about disability in the Paralympics for like hardly anything.
Yeah.
But he was super cool. He was great. He was just like, okay, you do whatever you want to do.
Oh, nice.
And I'm super pleased I did that. It was a film called Rising Phoenix, which is great. It's on Netflix. No one's seen it. Watch it. It's brilliant.
I shall watch it. Your music as well seems to kind of bridge the gap between like sound effects or sound design and music. I spoke to Mark Mangini, who worked on Blade Runner, and he worked on the new Dune movie with Denis Villeneuve again. And you know, we spoke about how he's again brought on very early, and doesn't necessarily have a huge amount of interaction with the composer. Do you have a but still remains, they still somehow create this sort of soundscape that makes sense. Do you have any interactions with the sound design team?
Sometimes, I mean, not that much, and you know, it is kind of weird because I'm always trying to do, like, one of the biggest problems I've got with Spider-Verse 2 at the moment is I've developed a whole bunch of approaches that are really, really, really fucking cool, but I'm worried they're just going to fight with the sound effects. And it's already a thought of like, right, I've got this kind of, I don't tell anyone too much about it, but this kind of, you know, Spider-Verse 2, I really, like, all of us want to push it as far as we can push it, really. Yeah. Not just like, oh, here's Spider-Verse 1 again. So I'm sort of developing all these tools to write that are like unusual. Yeah. I've got this one and I'm like, it's really cool, but it's in the same sort of register as a lot of the effects, and it's going to be tricky to work out how we get through that. Yeah. But for me, like, the thing about sound design as an element of scoring is it's like, how do you create something memorable? Yeah. You know, like, I think every score wants to have something that you hear it. Like, for me, a good film score, you know, this stuff about you shouldn't notice it as bullshit. It's like, some films you should notice the score, other films you shouldn't. But a really good score, no matter whether you notice it or not in the film, when you hear it away from the film, will take you back to that world. So if you're writing something that's a bit generic, or could be any film, if someone hears it, they're unlikely to connect it to the film world they were in. Yes. Whereas if you've got a great, let's say you're writing an orchestral score, right? Like, a lot of orchestral scores can sound the same because they're using the same palette. Yeah. But you put a really iconic melody in there, or something that catches someone's attention, or a motif or something, then you've got some identity. And an easy way to get around that is create a sound palette that's got unusual elements in it. Then you instantly create an identity. You can hear the piece within 2 seconds and go, oh yeah, that's from that movie. Yeah. And immediately you think of like Jerry Goldsmith mixing bowls in Planet of the Apes or something, you know? Just yeah, I mean, like, even like, you know, you look at Chinatown by Jerry Goldsmith, you know, all you need to hear is that bendy high strings, and the or the kind of like piano wire sort of scrapes, and, you know, or even, let's say, like Basic Instinct, which is a great score by Jerry Goldsmith.
It is, yeah.
You know, that's just got a great melody, and like really recognizable straight away. You're like, boom, that's Basic Instinct. And that's kind of, you know, what you want to do. But with Spider-Man, we've got like the Prowler sound. Wow. You don't know what it is, but it's like you instantly go, I don't know what that is, but I recognize that because that's from Spider-Verse.
Yeah, and it evokes a sort of emotional response as well, doesn't it? Like, it makes the sort of hairs stand up on my neck and arms, that sound.
Yeah, no, it's a great noise, that.
Working with Danny Boyle on Steve Jobs, written by Aaron Sorkin, I mean, was there ever any sort of concern or reluctance to work on that, given that his scripts are particularly wordy? Like, is there going to be enough room for my score? Did that ever cross your mind?
To be honest, if someone goes, "Do you want to do a film with Danny Boyle written by Sorkin?" You're like, "Oh no, I don't think I'll do that. Nah, give me something else." No, like Aaron's scripts. I've done 3 films with him now. As a director, and Steve Jobs with Danny as director. And often I'll get the scripts and I'll be like, "This script is brilliant. What am I going to do?" And that's always the fun challenge with his films, is like working out, right, where do I fit in? What am I going to do? It's the same with Yesterday, which wasn't a Sorkin one. I was like, this is great, but like, it's going to have Beatles music everywhere. What am I going to do?
Yeah.
And again, a whole bunch of stuff, it turns out.
Yeah, and I was watching Molly's Game again the other night, and just wondering how that relationship with Aaron Sorkin kind of developed over having worked with him on Steve Jobs. Like, did you get to a point where, and I'm assuming you're this kind of composer where the director might have some idea and you can flip it on its head and tell them, actually, no, that isn't what you want?
Yeah, I mean, like with Molly's Game, that was the first time I'd worked directly with Aaron. And he initially was like, "I want a big orchestral score." And I was like, "No, you don't. You want a contemporary rock or electronic-based score, not an orchestral score. In fact, there'll be no orchestra anywhere on this score." And he was like, "What?" I was like, "Look, I think this is the right approach. Let me try it. If it doesn't work, we'll do an orchestral score, but I think this is what the film needs." And so he was like, all right. I'll let you run with that. And we did it, and it worked out great. And so with that, you build a bit of trust. And he was like, "Oh, I was wrong." And so each film you do with them, you build trust. Like we had a thing on Being the Ricardos, where we'd have this huge ending piece. And I'm like, "Look, the demo is going to sound a bit shit, but the final thing will sound brilliant." And, if that was the first time I worked with him, he'd probably be like, no, I don't like this. And you'd have to write it differently. You'd have to write it so the demo really sold the idea, which would mean you'd have to literally write a different kind of cue, because certain cues do not demo up very well. But trust is built. And so he was like, "Yep, I trust you. Boom, let's do it." And it's great. And then like with Aaron, it's a really interesting relationship. Some things he'll just be like, "This is great," signed off in one. Others, it's like we'll go back and forth for ages trying to get it just right. Or he'll have a certain vision and we're still working out what it is. But he's a great collaborator. He's got a great sort of team around him as well. He's got a great editor called Alan Baumgarten. So we'll all work very closely together. And it's that nice thing of when you've worked with people a bunch of times, there's just a shorthand of like, and also they know if you're sticking your feet in, because there'll be some cues you're like even now I'm doing a Nola Holmes 2. Right, Harry, the director, or Adam will be like, "Oh, can we change this?" So I'm like, okay. And then there's one bit they want to change this. I'm like, no, that is the best. That's really good, that bit. I really, really, really don't want to change it. And in fact, I kind of almost refuse to change it as hard as I can. And I will push as hard as I can to save this bit. And they'll be like, okay, if you think that strongly about it, then obviously there's something in that. And I'll be like, yes, we're not changing that bit there.
And they trust you.
Yeah, but you've got to, at the same time...
It takes a while to build.
You've got to be willing to change. It's not stubbornness. At the end of the day, it's trying to protect the movie. And that's the sort of, my biggest sort of concern with all these things is always like, how do you make the movie the best it can be?
Yeah. I imagine as well that, well, I'll rephrase this. Is there a danger that the Daniel Pemberton score for AX film is going to want to be replicated by another director? Have you had that situation where where your agent contacts you and says, right, they want something like this that you've already done?
Luckily I haven't had any hit films. So I've had lots of films that have like been well received, but I've never had that like super huge massive success where everyone's just like, just give me that score over and over again, which has proved good for me, and it's meant I could keep changing what I do. Sometimes they do temp, like King Arthur gets temped in a lot of stuff. But I'll look at film, and I think if they just want me to do something I've done before, I'm not that interested in it.
Yeah. Working with Ridley Scott as well must have been quite a challenge. I mean, he's known as a very sort of visual director, very demanding director. Kind of knows what he wants. Is he? Was he particularly sort of collaborative with you, letting you have a bit of room to kind of come up with something new and interesting, or did he sort of define what he wanted early?
No, Ridley's brilliant.
Really?
Like, he's like, the thing about Ridley is if you're on his films, he's like, right, you're on it because you're good.
Right.
So just do what you think is right,
Mm-hmm.
and he'll let you run with that, and then he'll, like, you know, give some direction. But he's very good at being like, right, what's your take on this? You know, on sort of Counsellor and All the Money in the World. Both like, right, I'd start coming up with ideas, we'd throw them at him, me and the editor, and, you know, he'd respond well to some, not so well to others, and you'd start finding a path through it that way. But, you know, Ridley, also talking about mentors, you know, had a huge impact, because, you know, doing that film with him, The Counsellor, you know, I'd done one movie really by that point, which was The Awakening with Nick Murphy, and it's a great film, The Awakening, but hardly anyone saw it.
Yeah. And
hardly anyone talked about it, and all it takes is one person, you know, the right person, and Ridley Scott had seen it and loved the music and came in one day being like, man, I just saw this movie, it's great, I love the score, and I happened to know his editor at that point, and he was like, well, that's this guy, you should meet him, Daniel, his editor, Pietro Scalia. So I went in for a meeting with Ridley. He sort of quizzed me about, you know, how I did things, where I worked, what I'd done before, and he sort of says at the end, you know, you've done your 10,000 hours in TV, you know, like, I learned how to direct doing my 10,000 hours in advertising. That's how I became a director. Yeah. So I just thought, oh man, I met Ridley Scott, I've got a cool story about meeting Ridley Scott. Thought that was it. And then a couple of days later, I get this call saying, right, you're doing a film, he wants you to do the film. And I was like, wow, fuck. And that had a huge impact on me because, you know, in the industry, you know, working with Ridley is, you know, he can kind of work with anyone he wants, really. And so that kind of seal of approval of, like, him saying, yeah, but I want to work with him, you know, had a really big impact.
Yeah. Is there a part of the process that you kind of relish the most? Is it that initial kind of meeting with a director, or is it, you know, scoring it with an orchestra? Or?
No, my favourite bit, if I'm really honest, is sitting at home coming up with ideas and getting stuff I get excited by, and getting like, I will write things at home and sometimes I make myself cry. And that's the best bit, when you sit there where you're just like, oh my god, or goosebumps. You get a moment where you're like, oh my god. And when those happen, you're like, I have to protect that. We've got this thing at Nola at the moment where there's a couple of bits where, like, there's about 8 bars in a sequence, only like 8 bars long, and I'm really protective of them, and we're having a bit of a tussle over them. But, you know, I did this thing and it gave me like these huge goosebumps, and I'm like, okay, like, if I got that, someone in the cinema will get that, or watching at home will get that, and that's what I want to give them, like those moments where you go, you know, you get that big emotional push. And like, and it's interesting with film music because that is not constant. You need to have those moments at the right time. You can't have them all the time because they don't really work. You
have to earn it, don't you? Yeah.
And yeah, that's my favourite, to be honest, because it's that initial thing when you get the spark. It's great. And it's like, by the time you get to recording it, it's cool, but by that time you've been through so many iterations, so many edits, you've had it orchestrated, reorchestrated, made your notes. You know, you're like making sure the orchestral session goes well, and it's great, but it's also never as great as the first moment of creation is like the most exciting.
You strike me as somebody that's always, you know, trying to push forward and push on to the next project and develop something new. Do you ever give yourself the chance to kind of look back at what you have done and experience it as a viewer or listener?
Yeah. I mean, I sadly do like listening to some of my old scores. They're kind of like, which sounds like someone told me that's really egotistical, and I'm like, no, because I'm making music that I want to hear.
Yeah, well, that's the important
thing. So it's kind of like I'm trying to make the scores that the ones I want to hear, and so that means I enjoy them. Like, it's funny when you finish a film, there'll always be a couple of cues you're like, oh man, I really enjoy listening to that one. Other ones like, I never want to hear that one again. I like, the favourite way for me to revisit a film is if it's on a repeat and I catch it by chance years later. Because by the time you finish a film, when you go to premieres, I kind of hate premieres because you watch the movie and all you can see are all the bits that haven't gone the way you wanted to, or the mix is wrong, or like
it's too fresh in your mind.
Yeah,
kind of thing.
And you're just sort of bruised from all the battles and you know, like things you've gone through. Whereas, you know, a couple of years later you forgot it all and you watch it and you're like, oh, that's like Yeah, it's pretty good. It's like funny, I did this series and I didn't really want to watch it. I won't say what it is. I was just fed up by the end, and then over Christmas I watched it with my parents, who loved it, and I'm like, oh my god, yeah, this is really good actually.
Last question then, because I'm taking up your time here. Last question: what are the biggest challenges that face you today as a composer?
I'd say the biggest is like, how do you write inventive and different music, but within the process of demos, notes, filmmaking. Like, the hardest thing is writing like film music, which is like the craft of putting stuff to picture in a way that, as an artist, which is almost not putting stuff to picture and just creating something as your vision, and dealing with constant notes, edit changes. Because if you work in a way that is unusual, the tools don't really exist to do it. There's loads of tools to make film music sound like other film music scores. Yeah. But when you're trying to do something that doesn't sound like other film music, you have to sort of build the tools yourself, and those tools have limitations. So, example would be, you want to do something with a sort of crazy, let's say a crazy flute put through distortion pedal or something. It's like, if you don't have that as a sampled instrument, or the sampled instrument no way gets through the complexity of what you're trying to do, you either have to do something with a player every time, which is kind of doesn't really work in terms of the time you have to turn things over, or you sort of do it once and edit it down. It's like there's lots of these slightly boring challenges, which people don't really think about with film music. They just think, oh, that piece of music was shit, or that piece of music was good. But to get to that place, you might have gone through constant changes, iterations, notes, and like by the time you get something in a film, every piece has generally changed a bunch of times from what they initially were. So that's kind of the biggest challenge.
I think we should stop it there. That's brilliant.
Okay. All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Well, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Daniel there. I had a really nice afternoon chatting with him. Thanks to Daniel for finding the time in your extremely busy schedule. Cheers, really appreciate it, and hope to stay in touch as well. And because of my currently busy schedule, I'm a little behind on the recording of my next couple of episodes, but rest assured there will be 2 per month as long as I'm still enjoying doing this, and I am enjoying it. I still have makeup and prosthetics expert Gino Acevedo lined up, as well as a documentarian. And as soon as my busy period of work is over, I'll be back to chasing up some of the other people I've contacted, and fingers crossed that all works out, because I've got some good potential guests lined up in the next few months. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you can do so again for the next episode of the Filmumentaries podcast.